Welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is how climate change impacts community in the Midwest and what we can do about it. Our session will last about 50 minutes or so, give or take. My name is Wendy Tremblay, and I am the Community Engagement Manager with Wild Rivers Conservancy. I will be in the background moderating the session today, helping with chat and any technical difficulties during the session. Before we begin, I'd like to mention a couple of housekeeping notes. On the right side of your screen, you'll see a chat box. To keep things really simple and the presentation moving along, we're going to use chat to share any comments or questions that you have during our presentation. We encourage you to type the questions into the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation with Seth. This session is being recorded and will be made permanently available on the Wild Rivers Conservancy YouTube channel. And I think that's it. With housekeeping out of the way, I'd love to introduce our speaker and give the rest of the time to them. So please welcome Seth Spencer, the Teach Climate Coordinator with Climate Generation.
Yeah, well, good morning, everybody. Yes, this is kind of a new tech platform for me. So hopefully we can get through all those tech issues and we can just have a little bit of interaction as we go. And so there will be a couple times that I might ask all of you a question. And I know there's a little bit of a delay. So I'll try, you might hear kind of that awkward pause as I just wait to see if anybody has a response in the chat. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and get started. As Wendy said, my name is Seth Spencer. I'm the Teach Climate Network Coordinator for an organization called Climate Generation that I'll talk more about in just a minute. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm coming to you from the traditional and contemporary home of the Dakota and Anishinaabe down in Apple Valley, Minnesota, which is just south of Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's not in the Namakagon and St. Croix watershed, just a little bit south, but I am originally from Duluth, Minnesota. I'll talk about that. And I actually lived and worked right off the Namakagon for a year or so. So I'm quite familiar with the St. Croix River. So as I mentioned, I do work for an organization called Climate Generation based in Minneapolis. This is a picture of our office. You can kind of see a little bit where we're located. But to give a little bit of background of why I wanted to speak to you all today, Climate Generation was founded by this gentleman who is Will Steger. And Will Steger is a Minnesotan who was a former science educator in Minnesota. And Will decided that he wanted to go on expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic regions. So in the kind of 80s and 90s, he made some of the first human-powered or walking, skiing, dog sled-powered treks across the entire part of Antarctica and parts of the Arctic. And upon his return back, especially to Minnesota, he really wanted to share with people his experience, but especially his experience with how every time he was going on these expeditions, the land around him was changing, and how that change due to climate change was going to impact the world, the earth, but specifically people and plants and animals. And so you'll hear me a couple of times talking about like the power of our story of how we're connected to where we live, to our school, to the things that we like to do, and how climate change already is and will be impacting all of that. So this is going to be one of those times that I ask you to think a little bit, and we'll see if there's any interaction, but just especially if there's any classrooms, you can put a couple different responses. But what comes to mind when you think of climate change? And I'm going to just pause a little bit and let folks respond to that. I'll give you about a minute, and I'll just try to keep an eye on the chat. And I'll wait another few seconds. I'm not seeing any responses yet, but that may be a setting that I'm not aware of, but I'll give folks a second. Oh, there we go. So Tanner says large rain events. Let's see if there's any others, and that's okay if there's not. Warmer temperatures, extreme weather events. Thanks, Angela. So yeah, we're going to be, as we kind of move forward, we're going to be talking about climate change and how we as Midwesterners, folks in Minnesota and Wisconsin, kind of view climate change, because often, even in textbooks, but especially in social media, the news, Hollywood, we often talk about climate change as something that happens incredibly far from here. Usually when I ask students, and this answer really has not changed in the 20 years since I was in the classroom, of who or what climate change is going to impact the most, often I hear polar bears. Polar bears are going to cease to exist because all the ice is going to melt. And while polar bears will and are being impacted by climate change in a lot of different ways, to really do anything about the negative impacts of climate change, we of course need to realize that it is impacting us even thousands of miles from the ocean with sea level rise, and really think about how climate overall, but especially the changes to our climate are going to impact the ways that we recreate, even the way that we grow food and things like that. So I mentioned that I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my own climate story. You can probably tell this is not a picture from Minnesota or Wisconsin. I said I'm from Duluth, but I lived in a place called Homer, Alaska, which is on the ocean, for about 5 years. And this is a picture of Alaska. And you may see something in the very background of why I talk about climate change, why climate change is so important to me. Way in the back, you'll see a bunch of white in a flat area, and that's a glacier. And that's one of thousands of glaciers throughout Alaska and in northern Canada that is receding or melting. And something like 99%, so almost every single glacier in Alaska has receded or melted over the last 100 years, just like this picture. So this is another glacier in Alaska, and you can see a picture from about 110 years ago and a picture from 20 years ago. And that glacier has receded or melted almost 6 miles. That lake is about 6 miles long. And so people that have lived in Homer their entire lives were seeing these changes. Now you might say, Seth, we don't have a single glacier in Minnesota or Wisconsin. We haven't had glaciers for 10,000 plus years. So why are you talking about it? Well, that was the kind of the challenge. I could see these impacts happening in Alaska, but moving back to Minnesota, I struggled for a little while of how do I make this hit home for people? What the heck does climate change have to do with our daily lives in the Midwest? And then, just like your responses, it started to hit home a little bit more. So scientists have already seen that one of the main ways that climate change is and will be impacting Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois are extreme weather events, specifically large rain, sometimes snow, but usually large rain events. So flash flooding, like the picture on the left, is going to become more and more common. I think this is a picture actually from the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, right along the Mississippi. And then you'll see a picture on the right of a seal. And again, you might ask, Seth, why did you include a picture of a seal in Minnesota? Well, this is a picture of a seal in Duluth on a street. And again, you might wonder, how the heck did a seal get on a street in northern Minnesota? Well, this is a seal, a very famous seal that was at the Duluth Zoo in 2012. And it started to rain, and it rained so much that the entire zoo flooded. And that seal got out of the zoo and started swimming around the street. Well, the polar bear that was at the zoo also got out of its enclosure. It luckily stayed within the zoo, so it wasn't roaming around the streets. Um, but that storm that caused that flooding was a once in 100-year storm. So it should happen once in 100 years. Well, unfortunately, in the last 12 years, those types of storms have happened 3 more times in Duluth and around Lake Superior. And so when I really talk about climate change, I really want to share that things like extreme weather, so hail, flash flooding, wind are going to become more and more common here in Minnesota and Wisconsin and along the St. Croix River watershed. So I do share a very, very brief, this will be like 30 seconds of a crash course into the science of why climate change is happening. You probably have already talked about this in class. But we have this big, really important thing called the sun that helps heat the earth. And without the sun, there'd just be ice and there would be no life. So the sun helps heat the earth. And we have these sun rays and they come down and they hit the earth and they warm us up. But a lot of that heat and a lot of those rays bounce off back into the atmosphere. And before about 150 years ago, much of that heat would just escape out into space, and that was good. But this is where I often ask students, and I won't wait for a response, but I ask, what changed about 150, 160 years ago that might have stopped that heat from being able to escape? And again, you might think, oh, this is just a science class. But in history, you may have talked about something called the Industrial Revolution. So basically, we started producing things that required us to burn things. And so in that burning, we gave off greenhouse gases, carbon emissions, often by either burning wood, by burning oil. And so those greenhouse gases actually started to trap a lot of that heat. And that's why you probably don't hear it too much anymore. But when I was in middle and high school, we called it global warming. The globe was just going to keep warming. And yes, that is definitely what's happening. But climate change has become the kind of more common term because it's not just global warming. Lots and lots of not so great things are happening because of humans burning gas and oil and wood. And so all of these changes are going to impact lots and lots of different parts of our life. Now, I will get to a point in our presentation where I talk about what can we do about it, because it does come off as quite scary, but there are definitely things that we can do or things that we can change to either slow the changes that are happening or really adapt to them and really be able to kind of change the way that we do things. So you will see that I share a fair amount of graphs or data, and you're like, oh my goodness, Seth, I don't want to be in a math class. But a lot of these graphs and data are really important for us to see a couple things. One is that the Earth is changing, and our climate, which is basically the weather in an area year after year, is changing, and that we can really see all these changes have happened in the last 140, 150 years. So we can really see that those changes are human caused, because I go on social media every couple of days and I just try to kind of see what people are sharing. And there's a lot of information about, I think most of us have come to terms that climate change is happening, but there's still a little bit of debate out there about why it's happening, because the climate of our world does change. And it has changed for millions of years. But why we know that it is human cause of how fast it's changing. 140 years is kind of the blink of an eye of the world. And so all these changes are so quick that humans, we can adapt to them. But things like plants and animals, that's too short of a time for them to kind of change their behaviors to really be okay with these changes. So what this graph kind of shows is we've got the amount of carbon dioxide, which is, again, a natural thing. We breathe it out, but the amount is kind of unprecedented, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and you can see that it's kind of skyrocketing over the last 50 years. And this is directly connected to our temperature rise. And that again started about 140 years ago, right at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And on the left, you'll see these kind of weird blue numbers that are Celsius, which you're like, I don't know the Celsius, but basically that's about that +1 is about 2.5 degrees. And again, you might say, Seth, why does 2.5 degrees matter at all? It might be 2.5 degrees difference in the next 10 minutes. I can change to that. And again, yes, we can adapt to that, but things like trees, plants, and small animals, insects, that 2.5 degrees really does throw things off. And again, that's 2.5 degrees all across the world, and year after, well, over that time. And so things like the ocean, 2.5 degrees is a pretty crazy thing in that amount of time to change. And so it's just important for us to remember that even though it seems like a small change, it has pretty crazy impacts on plants and animals. Okay. Now, again, I probably won't wait for an answer, but I want you to think about it. I want you to make a guess in your classroom. Of the 10 hottest years ever recorded by scientists, so the 10 hottest years, how many do you think have happened in your lifetime? Now, if you're a little older, you might guess lots of different guesses, but if you're a student, maybe 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, I want you to think about how many of those 10 hottest years on record have happened in your life. And I want you to make a guess. And I'm going to just pause as you kind of share your guesses. And so the possibilities are either 0 have happened in your lifetime, 3, 4, 5, 6, or all 10 have happened in your lifetime. Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Wendy. I see a guess of 8. 8. Wendy thinks 8 of the 10 hottest years ever have either happened during a student's lifetime or even in Wendy's lifetime. Well, this is kind of the crazy thing. All 10 have happened in your lifetime, and all 10 have happened in the last 10 years. And so when we say, okay, things are getting warmer, that's not great, we can say, yes, it's really not great that all of the 10 last years have been warmer than every year before that. And so again, you see on the left column, like 0.2 degrees Celsius, 1 degree Celsius. It's only 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, which again doesn't seem like much, but every single one of you students can think back to last year, which I know is hard. I sometimes forget what happened last week, but last year you can probably think about, especially in Minnesota, Wisconsin, our winter. What was that like? We didn't have snow down here in Minneapolis for most of the winter, but in November, December, January, February, we were setting hottest daily records almost every single week. We can think back to last summer. Again, very, very hot, especially in our cities. And then if you think back to, I think it was late June, July, there might have even been days that your families recommended that you didn't go outside. And I'm going to give you a few seconds to try to think back to last summer, why that was. So yes, it was hot. Some students guess air pollution. And yes, that is right. But I want you to think about specifically what kind of air pollution. Why was the air some days actually very unhealthy to breathe? There was even a week where Minneapolis, Minnesota had the worst air quality in the entire world, which does not happen very often. And it had to do with forest fires, which again, we have a lot of forests in northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, especially around the St. Croix River watershed. But these forest fires were not in Minnesota, Wisconsin. They were in Canada. And that's, I think, a crazy thing for us to kind of be thinking about. that the impacts or what's going to happen from climate change won't just impact us right here. It might come from a crazy distance, especially from things like forest fires. So we often see forest fires in California or Idaho or Colorado, places that often can get very dry. You think Minnesota, Wisconsin, it rains a lot. Why would we ever have a problem with forest fires? But again, just that little bit of increase, maybe that little bit of drought causes areas, especially in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, but often even into Canada, to be incredibly dry. And all you need is a simple thunderstorm, lightning, and we have these crazy forest fires that can even cause air quality or air pollution down here, but it was really causing issues across all the way from New York to Washington. And so again, you might say, Seth, you're painting this horrible picture. And I think it's just important for us to kind of be aware of what is happening now, because this was last year. This year, we've already had a really early spring. Our flowers are blooming. The birds are back. They're probably like, what the heck? I shouldn't be here for another few weeks. And so we kind of need to know what's happening now to kind of think about what will 20 years from now look like, but also what do we need to change? What do we need to look for as we kind of move forward? Okay. So I've already shared a little bit about those greenhouse gases, but as we think, what can we possibly do about it? It's important to kind of check back in of where are these greenhouse gases or this air pollution that, is causing climate change? Where is it coming from? And you can see these different percentages, and you say, Seth, again, these graphs. But what we can say is there's probably three big ones. So industry, so making things, transportation. So you can say, oh, I have to take a bus to school. Yes, it is causing a little bit of carbon emissions, but often it's transportation of stuff. So trucks and a little bit of trains and planes, and then the production of good old electricity. And so when we think about how do we move to, you might hear clean energy, or how do we move to a green economy, these big words, this is going to be the things that we probably need to change, not just you or me, but everybody in the United States and really everybody in the world. And so I think also it's important, we often hear in social media or even in ads that you or I are the ones that need to make the change. We need to recycle. We need to maybe stop buying so many things from Amazon. You can say, Mom and Dad, stop buying so many things from Amazon. But when we look at that very small percentage of residential, that's like, those are the choices you or me are making. And so, yes, we can change some of those small things. And again, as a student, you might think, Seth, I don't control what my parents buy or how I get to school. And that's true. But again, it's important for us to be aware of that. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those choices that even I, somebody who likes to talk about climate change, either does or does not make on a daily basis. And then I think it's, especially in Minnesota, Wisconsin, it's important for us to be aware of that agriculture piece. I think, unfortunately, they often kind of get thrown under the bus. Oh, agriculture. Yes, that is still part of it. But 10% is pretty small compared to some of these much bigger things. And then going back to some of those impacts, this is a map or a graph of extreme weather last year and how much money these extreme weather events basically cost the United States. And I think this is, again, an important thing to talk about, especially when we talk about Minnesota or Wisconsin. Often, again, in the news where we say climate change is happening, well, it's happening in California with forest fires. It's happening in Florida with hurricanes. It's happening in Texas with fires, hurricanes, winter storms. But you can see that the Midwest often, if you want to include all the way Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, gets some of the worst impacts of those extreme weather events from things like tornadoes, from hailstorms. And so, again, it's important for us to kind of think about climate change is already changing our daily lives, impacting our daily lives. And some of these impacts, unfortunately, are going to keep getting worse. So we kind of have to think a little bit about how do we prepare. You might hear adapt. I say prepare for these changes. And so some of those worst impacts from extreme weather are kind of in that area. You might hear Tornado Alley. And you might even think like, oh, I look at this, I should just move to Montana. Nothing bad from climate change ever happens. Well, as people move around, you may have already heard that there are people in California moving to Wisconsin and Minnesota because of the impacts of forest fires and droughts. It will probably change where people decide to live in the next 20 or 30 years. And so you might say, nobody lives in rural Wisconsin or Minnesota. That is probably going to change as well. And so again, it's just kind of important for us to be aware of what's happening throughout the Midwest. Okay, so again, how are things going? Right here, you'll see a few graphs that really highlight Minnesota. That is where I have most of my data, but a lot of these are also true for Wisconsin, though Wisconsin does go a little further south. So some of those impacts of heat are going to actually even be more or worse. So you heard me talk about heat, temperature. It's going to get warmer. Yes. But one of the biggest impacts, especially if you were around this winter, that you already know about, is that our winters are not getting as cold as, say, 50 years ago. And that's a problem for many people that live in Minnesota, Wisconsin, because of the things that we like to do in the winter. You and your family might like to go cross-country skiing. You might like to go ice fishing. You might like to even have a snowball fight. And all of the data that we're seeing from climate change is that our winters are really going to be impacted. We're not getting as cold. And yes, there might still be snow. 2 years ago, we had a crazy amount of snow. But it doesn't get down into those negative 30s and 40s that we used to get in Minnesota and Wisconsin. You might say, Seth, that's awesome. I really don't like it getting that cold. And again, it might be awesome for us. But if we think about how our plants and animals have adapted to that cold, we had to kind of be thinking, well, maybe that's not so great. Maybe that black bear that was supposed to hibernate all winter long is suddenly waking up and is kind of grumpy in the middle of January because it's too warm. Or maybe that bird shows up too early and there's no mosquitoes around or no bugs around to eat in March. Or this is one that I've been hearing a lot about over the last couple of weeks, ticks. Ticks, unfortunately, are probably going to get worse in Minnesota, Wisconsin as those temperatures and that amount of moisture water warms up. And so we're going to have more ticks and new ticks. Ticks that used to not be in Minnesota, Wisconsin are going to come up from places like Missouri and Kentucky and start impacting, again, our animals. They're usually the ones that get it first: deer, fox, things like that. But of course, us as well. Okay. Again, this can be true of Wisconsin. Our climate is going to change of what's kind of more normal. So we have a cool climate. It rains, it snows. But over the next 50 or 100 years, scientists think that Minnesota's climate is going to become more like Kansas or northern Oklahoma. And then our winters are going to be like southern Wisconsin or northern Illinois, kind of like Chicago, not getting as cold, maybe still a lot of snow, but not nearly as cold as we used to. Okay, again, lots and lots of data showing that we're going to probably get more rain. And again, you'll see Wisconsin is like grayed out. We're not really sure. Wisconsin's a big state. Some places are going to get more rain. Right along like Lake Superior and Lake Michigan may actually get more snow as the amount of lots of different things, but the amount of water in Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, how warm the lakes are going to get. This winter, those were like the only places in Wisconsin that were getting crazy amounts of snow were right along the lakes. Now, I'll show a couple graphs that might not mean anything to you because you're like, Seth, I don't live in Minneapolis or Milwaukee. But this is something I want us to again, connect to, and especially as we think about how the Midwest is impacted. As maybe more people move here, our cities are getting bigger. But you may have heard about this thing called urban heat islands or urban heat hotspots. But what it really shows is that our cities are impacted worse by these increases in temperature because they're already warmer from the amount of streets and buildings that they have. The sun takes all that all day, holds on to that heat, and then especially at night is much, much warmer than a place with trees and grass. And so again, a place like the St. Croix River watershed is incredibly important for kind of our preparation, our adaptation to climate change, because the amount of trees and kind of green spaces that the watershed has. So again, you see really downtown Minneapolis can be 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding area. Milwaukee, the same thing. Again, I'll show just a couple graphs of our fall and winter being even warmer than maybe our summer change. Again, winter, especially in the places that most of you are connecting from today, you'll see sometimes even 5 degrees warmer. That again, Seth, 5 degrees doesn't matter, but we've already talked about the impacts that has on bears. But we also have to think about things like moose and deer. I often ask which animals are going to be impacted the worst, and people are like polar bears and penguins. Yes, but let's think a little bit more local. Things like moose. Moose, for a lot of different reasons, ticks, but also as there's less snow, it might be easier for them to survive the winter, but it also means that things like wolves have an easier time hunting, preying upon moose. Snowshoe hare, really going to have a problem if there's not a lot of snow around. All of a sudden, you got a white rabbit in the middle of January. Lots and lots of things can find it, can eat it. But there's again, deer, fox, things that raccoons are going to probably do okay. They can adapt a little quicker than some other animals. I might go through the next part a little bit, but I want us to think about, again, how different parts of our state are either ready, kind of prepared for climate change, or some are not prepared at all. And again, this is Chicago, not in Minnesota, Wisconsin. But you can see just a picture, and if you haven't seen on a graph before, red, usually bad, not so good, green, often better. So you'll see different parts of Chicago and where the air quality is the worst. That is often where the heat and kind of that heat urban island is also the worst. But I just show a few different pictures here. So again, this is about where different groups of people live in Chicago. And often it's along race lines, so historical race lines of where white communities or Black communities or Latino communities lived or could afford houses. But a lot of that goes back to that economic piece. I talked about how extreme weather really is costly and climate change is going to be costly, but it impacts all of us very, very differently. It impacts cities worse, but sometimes cities have maybe a little bit more money to put into streets or the way water flows than rural communities. And a lot of that we have to change in order to really be ready for some of those worse and worse impacts of climate change. I'll show one. This is probably really hard for you to see, but again, what this is showing is toxic releases to air, which is air pollution. And where is that worse in Minneapolis and St. Paul? It's downtown. And that's where there's a lot of apartment buildings, not big houses where people are really spread out. And so again, if you choose to or don't have a choice to live in a city, some of those impacts are going to be worse. And so I did a quick search of where a lot of you are joining from. Schools maybe a little bit outside of the metro, closer to the St. Croix River. Maybe you don't have to deal with some of these changes as much. But again, it's still important for us to think about. This is just a map showing some areas that we might have to kind of be thinking about, maybe don't have that money, that economics to be prepared for the impacts of climate change. So I've got a picture of the rock saying, don't cry, don't cry. What can we do about it? And I only have probably about 5 minutes left to share some of those, but I'll make sure that I do share out some additional resources, and I want to give a little bit of time if there are any questions. But I show pictures like this because I think it's, again, important for us to really be aware of what is possible, what is achievable. And so this is a map of things that we can do in our daily lives, maybe you, probably more your families, that actually have an impact on how much carbon we're releasing, how much air pollution we're releasing. So you'll see way down at the bottom, it says upgrade light bulbs. Light bulbs, they're an easy thing for us to change and often something we hear we can do. And it is important. Taking that individual action is important, but it has a lower impact. So you might see recycling, again, kind of a medium impact. Again, it's really important to do for maybe different reasons. It doesn't have a huge impact on reducing our carbon footprint or our carbon emissions. You might see eat a plant-based diet, and you're like, whoa, 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 Seth. I love bacon. I love a hamburger. And you're right, I do too. I lived in rural Wisconsin for quite a while, and I ate a lot of red meat. But over the last couple of years, I have changed that a little bit. I still get a burger every once in a while, but I've changed to eat a lot more venison. I actually really like venison, so I eat a lot more venison, and I eat a lot more wild fish. It's not something that everybody can do. That is one action that I have changed, because you'll see things like switch electric car. Well, I currently cannot afford most of the electric cars out there, things like the Teslas, the Rivians. They're not really feasible for most of us. And in a lot of areas, we're not quite set up for everybody to be driving electric cars. And then you'll see the kind of the biggest impact is have fewer kids. You're like, Seth, come on. Yeah, and that's important for us to think about, but maybe not something we're going to just drastically change. Everybody have fewer kids. I made the choice. I have 2 kids, knowing this even. And so, again, I think it's important to have those conversations, but also, like, is that really realistic, really possible? Okay. I won't go into this too much, but it's important for us to know that trees are one of the biggest impactors on how ready we are for the impacts of climate change. And so this is just a really interesting tool that you and your teachers can look at about how many trees you have. Again, from where I saw most of you joining from, your tree equity score is very high, which is good. It means that you have a lot of trees, you have a lot of shade, because we go back to that urban heat island. Areas without trees are hotter. Areas with shade are going to be cooler. They're cleaner. They make people happier. But again, as we build cities, even we're growing our small cities, we have to cut down trees. So we have to, again, think about the way that we design our communities as well. I'm going to probably go through some of this very quickly, just to leave a few minutes for questions. But I did just look up some kind of interesting things about Minnesota and Wisconsin, going back to that earlier graph I showed about electricity. The way that we produce electricity is a really important part of reducing our carbon emissions. And so you might hear things like clean or renewable energy. And I'll just tell you, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, that often is solar and wind. And it's really interesting looking at Minnesota, Wisconsin. We have a lot of things in common. This is one that we don't have much in common. There's a lot of reasons for that. But Minnesota and Wisconsin have gone 2 fairly separate directions around renewables right now. You'll see that Minnesota actually still has about, this is a few years old, but still about 30% of our electricity comes from coal. And when we think about some of the worst polluters or things, burning coal is one of the worst ways we can get electricity, unfortunately. We have a few, like about quarters from nuclear, but you're seeing now we're getting to about 30% from solar and wind. And so Minnesota is now one of the national leaders in switching to renewable energy. We're about top 5%. Okay. Wisconsin, this is again a few years old. Some of these have changed, but 50% coal. Natural gas, which isn't, it occurs naturally, but it's not natural to burn it. About a quarter nuclear, and then you see really tiny, about 8% comes from renewable. And again, we could have a whole presentation around why some of that is happening. But I think it's just, again, important for us to think about, if we're going to be wanting to make these changes, what are some of the changes that we need to make? I think I'm going to probably wrap up in just a second, but I'll try to share with some follow-up, some additional resources. This is just a really interesting one about all of these little dots have to do with where energy production is coming from and how it's coming from. And so you'll see a lot of dots in Minnesota. Most of those yellow ones have to do with solar farms. There's not very many in Wisconsin, but Wisconsin has a lot more hydroelectric. So things like dams, even right along or near the St. Croix River, probably more off the St. Croix River of actually producing energy. And then you'll see these big lines of natural gas or petroleum pipelines that go right through both of our states. So again, just things to be kind of thinking about, of like this big idea of climate change, but how do we bring it back to Minnesota and Wisconsin? And what are some of the changes in our daily lives at our school as we grow older and can make some of those choices about what we buy, how we get to work, to school, all of that. With that, I know I only have a couple minutes, and I don't know how many of you can respond or interact with the chat, but I'm going to stop sharing and just see if there are any questions that I can respond to. And overall, thanks so much for joining me. And I'll put in the chat my contact information. Would be happy to connect directly to you and your schools and your classrooms if folks are interested. But I'll see if Wendy has anything. Otherwise, I'll see if there's any questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks so much, Seth. This is really informative. I think as people are kind of writing their questions in the chat, I had one thought. I loved hearing your perspective on like kind of seeing the glacial melts in Alaska, and then kind of coming here and not really seeing the same impacts. I'm wondering if there are certain communities that might be impacted more than others. If you could share any information on that, that'd be great.
And Wendy, are you thinking across the world or specifically here in Minnesota, Wisconsin?
Yeah, I guess I was kind of thinking globally.
Okay. Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. So globally, it's really interesting. I told you, the news, Hollywood often talks about Arctic and Antarctic. Yes, those are the regions that are probably going to be impacted the most by these little changes in temperature. We're already seeing ice shelves breaking off, melting. And yes, it's important for us to be thinking about that. But if we want to think about where people live, it's not those places. It's our island nations. So often in the Pacific Ocean, these nations or even states like Hawaii that are very low to the ocean are going to have bigger issues. And we're already seeing places like Florida, Miami seems to be going underwater. New Orleans seems to be going underwater every year. And how sea level rise is probably one of the biggest ones. I don't often talk about it too much in Minnesota, Wisconsin, because we don't have to worry about it. But that is one of probably the biggest impacts that we're going to see. And even if you don't want to say that it's caused by people, we still need to be prepared for it because it is happening.
Yeah. Good to think about. All right. Any other questions that anybody had? Not seeing anything else in the chat currently. This was great. I really appreciated hearing your perspective on things, and I know Climate Generation does some great work with schools in the area too. We also, as you were talking a little bit about climate resilient trees, and our 12:30 talk with Alexis Monti is about climate resilient trees. So I'll have to keep on following along with our St. Croix Youth Summit, and we'll get some more climate information too. But yeah, well, thank you so much, Seth.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed the presentation. If there are no more questions, I think just, thanks for being here, and join us at 12:30 for our next sessions. Again, we have climate resilient trees and bogs of Wisconsin happening at 12:30. So take a little break for lunch, and we'll see you back here in a bit.